Good evening. Welcome to UPARS Los Angeles. My name is Steve Murillo. I am the director for UPARS LA. It is November 2018, and we have a very special guest with us tonight. His name is Preston Dennett. Preston is a UFO researcher of renown. I'm going to read his bio. He began investigating UFOs and the paranormal in 1986 when he realized that his friends, family, and coworkers were having dramatic and unexplained encounters with the unknown, with UFOs, ET. Since then, he has interviewed hundreds of witnesses and investigated a wide variety of paranormal phenomena. He is a field investigator for the Mutual UFO Network, a ghost hunter, a paranormal researcher, and the author of now more than 22 books, and some of them are on the table there, and he's got a very special offer for you tonight. He's written hundreds of articles on UFOs and the paranormal. His articles have appeared in numerous magazines like Fate, Atlantis Rising, the MUFON Journal, Nexus, Paranormal Magazine, UFO Magazine, Mysteries Magazine, Ufologist, and so on and on. His writing has been translated into several languages, including German, French, Portuguese, Russian, and Icelandic. There you go. He has appeared on numerous radio and television programs, including Midnight in the Desert with Art Bell, Coast to Coast, and also History Channel's Deep Sea UFOs and UFO Hunters. His research has been presented in the LA Times, LA Daily News, the Dallas Morning News, and other newspapers. He has taught classes on various paranormal activities and subjects and lectures across the United States. He currently resides in Reseda, California. So if you would, put your hands together, give a warm welcome for Preston Dennett. Welcome, Preston.
Thank you.
It's all yours.
All right. Thank you, guys. Really appreciate you coming here to listen to me speak. I've got an exciting presentation for you tonight. Just by a show of hands, how many of you have heard me speak before? Okay, quite a number of you. Wow. Humble. Thank you. So I won't go too deep into how I got into this, but for those who don't know me or haven't heard me speak before, I used to be very skeptical of UFOs, did not believe in them. It was in 1986, I heard a report in the news about a sighting over Alaska, and it interested me enough to start asking my family, friends, and coworkers what they thought of this ridiculous pilot who was clearly lying or on drugs or misproceeding. I'd bought the Air Force's explanation, debunking explanation, hook, line, and sinker. Found out that that wasn't the case. My brother had seen a UFO, he chased it down Reseda. My sister-in-law saw a UFO with her two friends over Van Nuys Air Force Reserve Base, and later had a face-to-face encounter at Stagg Street Elementary School with a gray-type ET. I brought it up at work. The lady I'd worked with for years says, "Oh yeah, me and my whole family watched a UFO darting around." Dorothy walks in, I'd worked with her for years. She's like, "Oh yeah, one followed us home from the library down in Koreatown." So this hit home for me. It hit me like a ton of bricks, and I just fell into it. I could not believe our planet was being invaded by aliens, and it seemed like nobody was talking about it. So I've devoted, 30 years now to studying this subject, and really got deep into it. So I'll just go right into my lecture tonight, which is about my 3 latest books, or very recent. It's a series of books which I have adapted from articles I've written over the years for various UFO magazines, which are now unavailable. And I realize about half of my research, or a third of it, was really not available to people. So I put these books together, updated them, and these books are mostly about the weirder side of UFO contact, the kind of cases that sort of defy the standard model. So I'm really excited about the presentation tonight. Haven't spoken a lot about this, so you guys are one of the first to really hear it. Now let's see. There we go. Okay, these are all the UFO books I've written. I've written a number of books on paranormal and Bigfoot, but about 14 or so on UFOs alone. This is the books I'll be talking about tonight. Volume 1, Volume 2, and Volume 3, each which contain 10 chapters exploring a various aspect of UFOs, the kind of cases a lot of researchers don't talk about. So I did mention this briefly in my last lecture about my book, Inside UFOs, but I wanted to go a little bit into it, not too deeply, because I did already speak a little bit about it. But what I found was a number of cases where people have had ET contact through the telephone. And I know how that sounds, but this actually fits right into how UFOs do affect electromagnetic instruments, everything from televisions, radios, car engines, and so on. But a lot of cases actually involve people who've been contacted by telephone. This is Jack Sarfati. He's a prominent quantum physicist. In 1952, he received a phone call from a computerized voice saying it was from a flying saucer, and would he like to have contact? And he said yes. He gathered all his friends together and waited for the UFO to show up. It never did. And he brought it up years later to his mom, and she says, well, that's not what happened at all. You had a series of phone calls from this thing, and you started acting very strangely. Started talking in very adult concepts, all about astronomy and physics and this sort of thing. She became concerned, answered the phone before he could the next time they called, and heard the same voice he had described, and said, don't call again. And they never did. But following that, as an adult, he became a very influential quantum physicist, and talking about Einstein-Rosen bridge and other things like quantum entanglement, which really kind of revolutionized physics. Now, this is not uncommon. There's a lot of cases like this. Debbie Jordan had a series of calls, came every Wednesday. Debbie Jordan is Bud Hopkins' star client in the book Intruders. And she had a number of calls coming on a weekly basis during her pregnancy with her youngest child. And these calls continued for the entire 9 months, the entire duration of her pregnancy. And she would hear a voice with lots of clicks and snaps, and she couldn't understand what they were saying. Just a weird kind of language, almost a different language, she said. And after her son was born, it stopped. But when he was about 3 years old, he had a speech impediment and started speaking in the same sort of tones and sounds, language that she had heard while pregnant with him. So, which is odd to say the least. Happened to Betty Andreasen. She was talking with her husband, Bob Luca, when the ETs broke in. They were really angry. And talking, she says, lots of T's and L's, and very quickly. And she had an encounter later that night in which the ETs, the Greys, came and warned her of impending death in her family. This happened to Whitley Strieber as well. He had a number of strange phone calls, but the most remarkable incident that he reported was suddenly his stereo started talking to him and his wife, and they held a conversation. The only thing he really remembers is the very end of the conversation, in which the voice said, "We know something about you." A case just like that in Colorado, where a person's stereo started talking to them. They were having encounters with UFOs landing on their ranch, and all kinds of ET encounters, and Bigfoot, and all kinds of stuff, cattle mutilations. And this voice came on their stereo and basically warned them, said, don't mess around, don't try to interfere with our activities. So it's very bizarre. There's a lot of cases like this. This is Harold T. Wilkins. He wrote a couple of early books about UFOs, a real pioneer in this field. He also uncovered cases like this. He talks about one case in which people were driving along, saw a UFO, their car stalls, their radio starts fuzzing up, and a voice comes on and starts warning the passengers of our warlike ways, which is definitely one of the common themes when people are taken on board and given messages. It's often warnings of against violence or nuclear proliferation, this sort of thing. So that fits, again, right in with the pattern. There's another case just like that in London Airport. One interesting case I heard about took place in Colorado, in which two guys were driving along and saw 7 UFOs. And while they're looking at this, his phone rings. He didn't want to answer it because he was busy, watching these UFOs. And gets, the UFOs depart, and he looks at his phone, and the phone said the number was 777-7777. Very strange. Clearly, they were trying to communicate. I got another case like that myself, which I talked about in the last lecture. This guy named Kenneth in upstate New York had a series of encounters, and one of them involved a phone call, apparently from these ETs. And he answered the phone, and they said, "The time is coming. We will see you soon." And they did. He had an encounter shortly after that. And one final case I wanted to mention, a guy approached me when I was speaking in Irvine a couple of years ago, and I was talking about this, and he's like, "Well, I know of a case that occurred in the, not far from the Skinwalker Ranch in the Wintop Basin, where there's a lot of activity, where a young boy was watching TV, and suddenly the TV screen changed, and he could see the inside of a UFO, ran outside and saw that there was a UFO hovering over his house. Went back inside, tried to wake up his parents. They would not wake up. Went back to the TV and watched this thing for 5 minutes. What he saw were gray aliens and what appeared to be the inside of a UFO. So yeah, I mean, very strange. I'm not sure what to make of this other than ETs are able to affect electromagnetic instruments of all kinds, and why not tap into phones? Another example of this sort of behavior occurred during the 1952 wave over Washington, D.C., which a lot of people saw these craft. They were chased by jets. But what the air traffic controllers, Ritchie and Barnes, told researchers was that when they would radio the pilots to sort of intercept these objects, the occupants of the UFOs would immediately react and were obviously listening in because they'd dart away as soon as any jet was tried to be vectored towards the object. So yeah, they're probably tapping our computers and things like this. Wouldn't surprise me a bit. Another subject I want to talk about is what happens if you shoot at a UFO. And I can tell you in short, it's generally not a good idea, because you're not going to be able to affect it in most cases. And in some cases, they will fire back. Here's an early case, occurred at the Battle of LA. It's pretty well known. I won't go into it, because I'm sure you already know about it, other than to say that there was 1,400 rounds plus shot at this object, which didn't bring it down and apparently didn't affect it. Though there are now documents which appear to show that one of these objects was in fact shot down, according to Robert Wood and some official documents. So hard to say. But there's been a lot of cases where people have shot at UFOs. There was a very famous case in 1976 in Tehran, Iran, which a bunch of people were watching these objects dart all over the city. I talked to some first-hand witnesses, and this guy, General Parvez Jafari, was vectored towards the craft and was going to shoot at it. And as soon as he had been ordered to shoot at it and started to pull the trigger, his electronics completely failed. Again, showing that these ETs are monitoring the situation. They're not going to let you harm them. A lot of cases in which people have actually shot handguns or shotguns or revolvers at UFOs. There was a really interesting case which took place in Rio Vista in 1964. There was a huge wave of sightings over the town. This UFO kept showing up on a regular basis, kind of hovering over the local water tower. And people were getting photographs of it. There was hundreds of people gathering to watch these things. And two kids, they come running up with their shotgun, their .22 caliber rifle actually, and they shoot at it. And they could hear the bullets hitting this thing, going ping, ping. Didn't seem to affect it. There's a number of cases just like that. In 1967, in St. George, Utah, a gentleman by the name of Michael Campiador shot at a UFO that was hovering overhead. Again, he struck the object, but it didn't affect it, other than it went away at that point. This happened to Jack Hill, a night watchman for a lumber company in Wilmington, California. This was in 1967. He saw a UFO hovering over the lumber yard and fired 6 shots at it with his service revolver. When he did, all the lights went out and the object darted away. So there's been a lot of UFO shootouts. Of course, a very famous one is the 1955 Hopkinsville, Kentucky case, where these people not only saw a UFO, but were shooting directly at an ET, which didn't seem to harm it, but did keep it away. There are a number of cases like that as well. In 1973, Paul Brown of Georgia had a UFO land in front of him on the road. He whipped out his gun and pointed it at the ETs that were coming towards him. They turned around and got back in the UFO and left him alone. Doesn't always happen that way. In 1979, a Texas couple was drawn outside by UFOs landing in their backyard and saw gray-type ETs. He gets his gun out and his shotgun. Next thing they know, it's the next morning. They wake up and go out into the kitchen, and there's the shotgun completely dismantled on the kitchen table. So they weren't having the ETs. In 1954, an Italian farmer sees ETs and a UFO land in his yard, and they're trying to steal his rabbits. He grabs his gun and starts to shoot at them. Suddenly his gun becomes way too heavy, and he can't hold it, and drops it, and he's paralyzed. So yeah, a lot of cases like this where people have shot at UFOs or entities, or tried to. In 1973, a truck driver, Eugenio Douglas, shot at robot-like creatures. Turned out to be a mistake, because he was followed by this object, and hit by a beam of light, which caused minor burns on him. And he was lucky. There's another case, this was in Brazil, also in Brazil, to Inácio de Souza, who saw a UFO with ETs, pulled out his gun. He saw just kind of humanoid figures, they weren't raised, and shot at one, hit it in the chest. Immediately he was struck by a blue beam of light from another one of the ETs, which hit him in the chest. He felt terrible afterwards, had fever, was burning up, rushed to the hospital. He died 2 months later of probably radiation poisoning is what we would call it now. He lost a lot of weight and had a lot of terrible symptoms and died a horrible death. So generally speaking, I'm going to say, don't shoot at UFOs. There was a case in 1954 over in Korea. This is not the actual UFO, but this is a UFO that was seen during the Korean War. At this time, a UFO approached to within 2,000 feet of a U.S. military establishment. They launched a Hawk missile at it. The UFO shot out a beam of light and disabled the missile. There was another case, which was on MUFON TV, and I heard about elsewhere, in which UFOs were seen during the Vietnam War. There was a lot of cases at that time. One involved some people who shot at the UFO with a missile, and the UFO actually absorbed the missile and threw it back at the people who shot it. So yeah, don't shoot at UFOs. Probably not a good idea, and could be dangerous. All right, another thing I want to talk a little bit about, not too much, because I got a lot of subjects I want to cover, is alien zoos. And gosh, I know how that sounds. Most people, when they're taken on board, see perhaps a medical scenario, a medical room. Some may be taken to an engine room. There are a number of cases where people are taken and seen all kinds of stuff. One of John Mack's cases, he reports on a lady who was taken into a room on board a UFO, and she saw a full-on pine forest, complete with animals. This happened to Betty Andreasen, who was taken into a room where she saw a pond with fish in it and all kinds of plants. Carl Higden, he's a well-known abductee, a hunter. Back in 1974 in Rawlins, Wyoming, he saw a ET with orange spiky hair, very strange looking in a uniform, and tried to shoot at it, actually. The bullet stopped in midair and fell down, and next thing he knows, he's, to cut a long story short, he's been taken on board a craft. It was about 10 feet wide, he thought. On the inside, it was much larger than it appeared on the outside. And he's on board, he saw a bunch of animals, elk, in cages. And the ETs told him that they were taking the elk to do genetic testing. So there's a lot of cases in which animals have been taken. I know R.D. Six Killer Clark, who wrote 2 books on or abductions of indigenous people, mostly in South America, but also throughout in the United States. She reports on a case of a UFO that was abducting alligators out of a local pond. Now I know Carla Turner has reported on a case like this in which people saw strange animals on board a UFO. The Twigs, Denise and Bert Twiggs wrote this book, Secret Vows, which chronicled what started with abductions and kind of evolved into a full-blown contactee case with friendly ETs, and had a lot of very bizarre experiences, which I've heard before but aren't talked about a lot, and one of them is these alien zoos. And they said the ETs that they saw had a virtual Noah's Ark, that almost all the creatures on Earth and several from other places that they did not recognize. Katarina Wilson, a real estate broker from Oregon, also wrote a book about her experiences, which were largely negative. She also said she was taken to a place where she saw strange animals. She described them. One was like a primate. The other was a very large, unusual-looking cat-like creature. So I think the conclusions that we can draw from cases like this is that extinction is kind of a myth. ETs have been collecting animals for a very long time, and humanity is not going to go extinct because we know they've been taking our genetic material. Betty Andreessen had this experience, and she saw creatures that were from a long time ago, including what appeared to be cavemen. So yeah, I'm not too worried about species disappearing forever out of existence, but certainly the destruction of our planet is something the ETs are very concerned about, and could be why they're so interested in having these zoos. I want to talk a little bit about something that, gosh, really freaked me out a little bit when I first heard about this. Is UFOs over graveyards. I had no idea this was a thing, but apparently it is, and there are cases coming from a wide number of prominent investigators. Jim and Coral Lorenzen, they were early investigators, talked about a case where a lady ran a funeral parlor, and her son comes running in and says, "There's a UFO hovering, over the parlor." And she didn't believe him until about 2-3 days later, one of the people who visited the parlor to go visit a gravesite came running in and said that there was a UFO hovering over the building. And so this sort of thing actually happens quite a bit. In June 2011, an Illinois resident was drawn outside by barking dogs and saw a UFO hovering very low over the graveyard. In 1967, Jan Hynek reports on a case in Massachusetts in which a couple decided to go driving out and looking at the freshly fallen snow, and were driving by the local graveyard when they realized it was glowing. They pulled a U-turn, pulled up, and sort of parked there, leaving the engine on, and could see this object hovering over the graveyard. It was all this strange fog that isn't normally there, sort of obscuring things. The husband gets out, he was driving, and he goes to point at this thing, at which point his hand is pressed back up against the car, which the car engine fails, and he can't move. A couple of seconds later, this UFO darts off. He's able to move, the engine starts, and they drive away pretty freaked out. So my question is, what is going on here? Why are all these UFOs hovering over graveyards? There is a lot of them. Raymond Fowler reports on a case in 1964 in Massachusetts involving Robert Susi and William Chase, who saw a domed metallic disc hovering very low over the graveyard. 1957, police officers in Elmwood, Illinois, had the same experience. There's cases like this in Brazil and Canada and Spain. In some of these cases, graves are clearly being targeted, and some involve humanoids. There was one case in France in which a young boy was walking through a graveyard when he saw a humanoid which actually shot at him with a beam of light, chasing him away. This is Ricky Banyard. In 1967, he was near the Mount Pleasant Cemetery with his friend Glenn Coate. This is in Edmonton, Canada, when they saw a UFO that looked like this. And it appeared to be sending down beams of light onto the Mount Pleasant Cemetery. The next day, they inspected the cemetery and found numerous unexplained burn marks. Case just like that in England. Probably the granddaddy of all these graveyard cases is what happened in West Virginia. This is from a book by a reporter by the name of Bob Teets, who wrote West Virginia UFOs, one of the first books to really focus on a state. And he talks about dozens of people who have been seeing these UFOs hover over the Dean Memorial Cemetery and also the Nethkin Cemetery, which are family cemeteries. The families have lived there for quite a long time. These sightings occurred in the 1960s and 70s and were so regular, so predictable that people would go out and watch these objects. And again, these were clearly targeting grave sites, which they noticed because anytime there was a new grave, the UFOs would show up, hover over it, and send down a beam of light on it. Scott Corrales, a researcher, another researcher, also talked about this. He wrote an article as well. So something very strange is going on here. He thought perhaps they were recovering implants. That's not something I thought of. I was thinking, well, they're taking genetic material, which does survive for a while after death. But I think it would be a great opportunity for sort of a UFO stakeout, or perhaps investigating which graves these ETs are interested in and where these people have abductees. I don't know, but something very strange is going on here. To me, it sounds like extraterrestrial grave robbers. Kind of macabre and spooky, but this is what we're left with.
What about soul capture for collection?
I hadn't thought of that, but you know, there's all kinds of theories. Another thing I want to talk about is cases in which ETs are seen in public places. People generally think, oh, you know, if you're going to see an ET, it's going to be on board a UFO. It's not always the case. There are a number of cases where ETs are being seen in places they have no business being. A good example is what happened to Bruce Lee, the editor of Moral Books, who edited Whitley Strieber's book, Communion, and went into a New York bookstore because he saw that the book was being displayed, or expected to be. I was in the back of the store. He went there and saw two people in front of the display. They were all wrapped up in clothes, giant sunglasses. You couldn't see any of their skin. There was gloves on. And they were speed reading through the book and talking in kind of a strange way. And it was really peculiar. And he went up to them to sort of see what they thought of it. And one of them turned to him and scared the living daylights out of him. And he staggered away because he said he got like these guys were not human. These eyes were much too large. And they gave him this sort of look that freaked him out completely. And he ran to his wife and says, those are not people. He was pretty upset when this story came out, because he's not the only one who's had this type of case. There's a lady in Florida, Lisa Ahrens, who talked about an incident she had where she was at the gas station and sees this gorgeous, blonde, hunky man who really tries hard to get it on with her and basically seduces her. She finds herself driving home with him, something she's never done. And they're having, a good time being intimate when she sees the reflection in the mirror, and it's not a human, it's a gray. So they apparently have the ability to disguise themselves. This sort of thing happened to Debbie Jordan as well. Again, Bud Hopkins' client. This happened to a lady in New York, Shane Kurz. Hans Holzer wrote about this. This occurred in 1968. Shane and her mother had seen a UFO close up, and following that, she was at school, she was a teenager, when this very odd-looking person approached her, and he had white hair, kind of Asian-looking eyes, strange skin, he was dressed strangely, and he started asking all these bizarre questions about what she did at school, and did not seem to understand what sports were, or food, and things like this, and tried to coax her to go to his white vehicle parked in the field over there. And she said no. And she turned away to walk away, turned around, and he was gone. But several people came up to her after that and said, "Who was that person you were talking to?" She said, "I don't know." A couple of weeks later or so, I have to look up exactly, but she was at the convenience store, the drugstore, and saw another one of these figures, and it was staring at her and completely freaked her out. She later had a missing time abduction, and under hypnosis, she saw those figures that she had seen at the school and at the drugstore on board the UFO. They were the ones who were abducting her. This is John Hunter Gray. He's a well-known within the UFO field. He had an experience in Richland Center, Wisconsin, when he and his son had a typical missing time encounter with Gray-type ETs. As a result, he received a number of healings, actually. But what's very bizarre is immediately prior to their abduction, they were at the gas station, and there was this peculiar, very short, half-sized person looking at them with these very strange eyes. That's all they could see. Otherwise, it was completely bundled up. It was a very warm day. There was no reason to be dressed like this guy was. It had sunglasses on, fisherman's cap, gloves, the whole deal, and was just staring at them. And they thought, "Oh, that's weird." And as they drive away, this guy jumps in his car and follows them. And they tried to shake him. They slowed down. They sped up. This guy stayed on their tail the whole time. Finally turns off. At that point, the UFO comes and they're abducted. And they somehow connect this together. And I can see why. I mean, there's a lot of cases that are very similar to this. Timothy Good, well-known researcher, says he had an encounter at the Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan, New York. He had heard there were human-looking ETs and sent out a telepathic request. "If there's any here, sit down and communicate with me." A man sat down. He's like, "Well, if you're an ET, put your finger on the side of your nose," which the man did, turned, looked at him, and then quickly walked off. Timothy Good, who's a respected researcher, he's convinced that this was an ET. Not the only case he's had like that. So I know of other cases like this. Bud Hopkins talks about a case in 1969 in which a lady was on the subway in New York and looking ahead saw a gray ET that nobody seemed to notice. But she noticed it because it had these weird eyes, it was short, bald, and had this plastic-looking skin. She's like, "Why is nobody paying attention to this thing?" Another case in which a lady was at an outdoor cafe. This is also in New York, when a gray ET appeared right there. She had an abduction. Another case from MUFON involves a lady who saw an ET right at Penn Station. No one seemed to be seeing it. She walked right by it and it turned and looked at her. She said it was clearly not human. It wasn't a gray though. There's a number of cases where people have seen aliens apparently in casinos. I know Charles Hall talked about this. There's a few cases reported to MUFON. I know a case which occurred in the Tropicana Casino. It's very interesting. This gentleman was with a number of people looking at a UFO, went into his hotel room that night in Circus, and was woken up in the middle of the night by activity in his bathroom, tried to open the bathroom door, couldn't. Finally, he pulled it open, and 3-4 short figures came tumbling out and ran through the wall. He was knocked unconscious and woke up the next morning. So yeah, these guys can come anywhere. This slide here is from Misha Johnston, a Las Vegas researcher. She interviewed a guy who's worked at a casino as in security, who stayed in the ceiling and watched people through security cameras and saw these figures, these kind of gray type, almost Star Trek looking figures, which they thought was odd. And even odder was nobody else was paying any attention to them at all. It was as if they weren't there and they weren't interacting with anyone. They were just sort of observing. And at one point, one of the ETs turns and looks up directly into the camera, which was hidden. There should be no way he knows where it is. But apparently he did. And this footage was snuck out by the security guard. So, bizarre. So yeah, I think the conclusion we can draw from that is ETs do walk among us. And we should keep our eyes out. There's a lot more cases like this I could get into, but I've got much more I want to talk about. Real briefly, I want to talk about the alien-clown connection. This is something I ran across in a number of cases. One lady I talked to, Marcelina, had an encounter in Topanga Canyon. And as a child, she saw this ET come in and it was dressed up like a clown. It really freaked her out. This isn't like your typical screen memory where someone will say, see an owl. These figures actually appear to be dressed up. Hard to say, it's definitely related to the screen memory. But I got another case like this involving a lady, Laura Chateauguay, who had an encounter. This was also, again, some time ago. That was back on the East Coast. And she was telling me about a very close-up sighting she had. And she says, I don't know if this is related, but when I was a kid, this harlequin showed up in my room. And it was very bizarre because it had these huge eyes, had these little jingly bells on it, a velvet purple suit. She says the next thing she knows, she's in this rounded room, she's got no clothes on, and they're cutting her with this scalpel-like instrument. I'm like, yeah, might be related, I've heard this before. What I found is that this is actually pretty common. I brought it up once at a UFO support group, Barbara Lamb, I think, and I asked, well, how many of you have a fear of clowns? And everyone just went crazy. And they all did. And Bud Hopkins talked about cases like this, as well as Raymond Fowler. Peter Huff, English investigator, talked about a young girl who had an ET come into her room dressed up as a clown. Sometimes they'll come in dressed in other disguises. They'll wear wigs. Whitley Strieber had an experience where an ET appeared and it was wearing a pinstripe suit. I know of 3 or 4 other cases just like that, where ETs come in wearing old styles, 50s get-ups. Sometimes cowboy hats, that's actually pretty common. And lots of weird screen memories too. I've had a number of cases. There was one case where a guy was visited by ETs and they came dressed up as superheroes. And another lady, she says they were dressed up as 3-foot-tall teddy bears. And she didn't believe it because of their eyes, and they dropped the disguise. But yeah, all kinds of disguises. And I think the end result of this is that it's left people with a dread fear of clowns. And in our culture, you can see that. I mean, there's all kinds of horrible stories about clowns, whether it's, the killer clown from outer space and all these, sort of grim clown images. So I'm not sure why they're doing this, if it's to disguise themselves, cover their tracks, or to reduce the fear factor, but it hasn't really worked. People are just left with this chlorophobia, fear of clowns. Now I want to talk about something that I think is just fascinating. I've never heard anyone talking about this, and that's ETs and mines, and what are they doing with our precious metals? And I think it's extraordinary how many cases there are. I put together, I think, what is the largest collection of cases of about 20 at least, in which UFOs are seen hovering over mines. This is a worldwide phenomenon. This happened in the Belgian Congo mines in 1952, where these objects were seen persistently hovering over this mine to the point where they scrambled a jet to chase them away. And the CIA was very interested in this and did a whole investigation. We're not able to figure out what these objects were. This is a photo of the Brush Creek mine. This is a really interesting case, which occurred in 1953, early 1953, when 2 miners, John Black and John Van Allen, started seeing this UFO that was hovering over their titanium mine that they were working on. And they started having regular sightings. On April 20th, they saw a disc taking off from the mine area, went there and found tracks. On June 20th, they actually saw the landed UFO and the occupant itself. It's actually seen these objects on the same day, 3 months running. So when July 20th rolled around, Well, word had gotten out, and about 200 people showed up to see if these UFOs would show up for 4 months in a row. And they didn't. It was a complete bust, and the UFOs never came back over that mine. But the military certainly was interested in it and sent out investigators from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to look into this, and could not conclude that these guys were lying. They had no conception of this type of thing. We're not into science fiction or anything like this. But yeah, this is a thing. UFOs are hovering over our mines. This is the Para Verdue mine, iron mine, north of Perth, Australia. And in 2006, numerous witnesses saw this glowing red object right over the mine. Stayed there for a long time. Now, Arizona is the leading producer of copper in the United States. It's really the copper state. That was going to be its name. And boy, oh boy, they have a lot of activity over all their copper mines. This is the Tucson Goldmine. In December 2011, an Army engineer and a Special Air Forces major saw this object hovering over the mine. They weren't working on it. They were working in a nearby area. And it came twice after the second sighting. The Air Force showed up, and with military attack Cobra helicopters canvassing the whole site. So clearly they knew something else was going on. But after that second encounter, the Air Force major, he quit the job. He's like, I'm not working here anymore. It really freaked him out. This is the Pima copper mine in 1971. Workers there saw UFOs show up twice. This is the San Miguel copper mine in 1980. Two military officers, Officer George Parks was there, and he saw this metallic craft with portholes and figures behind each porthole while he was working on the night shift. It impressed him so deeply, he became a MUFON field investigator, and then the Pima County Section Director, and later the Section Director of the entire state of Arizona. So he's a great witness, and he again is one of these cases confirming that ETs are very interested in our minds. There seem to be a number of UFO attractors, nuclear power bases certainly. They're drawn to power lines, graveyards as we have seen, and mines is definitely a huge UFO attractor. There was another case that occurred at this same mine in 1947. Or no, actually it was at the Phelps Dodge mine in Bisbee, where several workers saw an object land actually on the copper mine itself. That happened again in 1980 when a rocket scientist and an NSA analyst and a gas station attendant saw this object hovering very low over the mine. It was close enough where they could have hit it with a rock, really freaked it out. It appeared to them that it was inspecting the mine because it was going over various areas and continued to do so for quite some time until it was chased away by a jet. One more case over Arizona, October 23rd, 1980, Morenci, Arizona was having a huge wave of sightings, and at one point there was this encounter in which numerous workers on the mine saw these objects hovering over the smokestacks and sending down beams of light into the smokestacks. This is a smelter, not an actual mine. And it was a boomerang-shaped object. And at one point, it actually sent down this little ball of light into one of the smokestacks. It was clearly very interested in what was going on there and started to move off. One of the witnesses says, "Oh, I wish you'd come back. I want to see you closer." Turned around, did a U-turn, came back, and then left. So it appeared to be monitoring not only the mine itself, but people's thoughts. So, I mean, there was a lot of other cases I could bring up. There was a case at the Gualcamayo mine in Peru in 2008. A UFO hovered over the mine and shut down all the electronic machines, shut down the whole mine. Workers were not able to work. There was two large groups of workers, all who saw it, and someone else actually was able to photograph the object. This happened in the 1960s at the Spring Creek mine in Twin Falls, Idaho, in which workers saw a UFO actually landing on the slag heap and pulling out ores. So they're clear, not only landing, but they're affecting our minds. A really interesting case, pretty well known, it was researched by Jacques Vallée. This occurred in the French Gulch gold mine in California in the 1960s and 1970s. This older couple were having all kinds of problems with this UFO hovering over their mine. At one point they had a humanoid encounter. It was hostile. They ended up having a very bad reaction. They had missing time and a number of injuries as a result of this encounter with a humanoid. There was other people, outside witnesses, who were seeing these UFOs. One also saw the humanoid. So it was not just them. At one point they found this strange pile of sand, which clearly had been put there not by them. So they collected it. Jacques Vallée got a sample and had it analyzed. It looked like sand, but the chemical analysis said, no, it's not sand at all. Not from this area. It was volcanic rock, sulfide-bearing rock, green crystals of feldspar and pyrite. It wasn't beach sand, it wasn't alluvial sand, it wasn't mine tailing sand. It was this weird mixture, which does not occur naturally, but all samples were presumably from Earth. There was nothing there they couldn't identify. The last case I want to talk about is the Karnes City, Texas uranium mine. 1971, Michael Harvey was working at this uranium mine to get the uranium ore. There was a lot of people there when this very, very large UFO showed up. Had little colored lights all around it, classic saucer, frightened a lot of people very badly. Several of them were crying, weeping because of this thing, sending down brilliant beams of light, like lasers, and eventually took off. Now it was sending down these lights on a 250-foot square area. There's a huge swath of uranium that runs through Texas. And they were mining it, and this object sends down this beam of light in this 250-foot circle. And when they went to dig there, the uranium had been depleted. It was turned into this chalky white substance. So I don't know if they were taking it or trying to prevent us from using it. Certainly they warn about nuclear power and the abuse of it quite a bit. But the point is, they're taking our precious metals, and I think this really speaks towards who we're dealing with. I mean, we can speculate all you want about who these ETs are and where they come from, but their behavior kind of speaks for itself. I think this points towards the probability that we're dealing with, ETs in the classic sense, with craft, and they want our metal. Okay, I want to talk about something that has been termed UFO investigators disease. And I found this was interesting. I realized very early on that a lot, if not most, of the prominent UFO researchers in this field have had contact, sometimes very extensive. I'm going to say most of them. David Jacobs is one who I don't think has claimed any contact. But other than that, gosh, I mean, the list is long. Oh, Bud Hopkins, certainly his research started as a result of a close-up sighting. Brad Steiger said he saw an ET when he was a child right outside his window. Barbara Lamb has come forward revealing a number of encounters that she's had. This is Leo Sprinkle, the first guy to actually use hypnosis to research missing time cases. And he had some of the markers of having contact, went under hypnosis himself, discovered that he had an experience as a child. Ed Conroy, who researched Whitley Strieber's case to see if it was a hoax or not, he ended up having encounters as well. So the point is, once you start looking into this, they start looking into you. Bill Hamilton said he had an abduction with his wife, who was actually an abductee. This was in believe, Area 51 area. Ray Fowler, he admitted towards the end of his research that he had encounters as a child, which he thinks kind of guided him to the Betty Andreasen case. So a lot of researchers, Richard Boylan had a number of sightings and later had a missing time encounter in New Mexico. Roger Lear, very famous local researcher, Lake Roger Lear, also said that he believes he was abducted out of his bedroom. His family came in looking for him. He wasn't there. Well, he had not left that night, so there was no way he could not have been there. So yeah, I mean, a lot of cases in which investigators are basically in bed with the phenomena. Once you start researching this stuff, I think the ETs keep a very close eye on this subject, and they'll start researching you. This happened to Edith Fiore, the first lady with a PhD to write a book about abductions. In her book, she describes how she had an encounter, apparently an onboard encounter with ETs. This happened to Colin Andrews. Of course, Stephen Greer has claimed encounters. I know a couple of MUFON field investigators who have had encounters and won't come public. I know a few very prominent investigators who also told me their own encounters, but have not talked about it publicly. So I do know that this happens to a lot of people. I'm thinking, gosh, what about me? I, as a child, no, I had nothing. I assumed that there was really no UFO history for me personally. It is within my family, certainly, and it continues to be. My nephews have seen UFOs. My nephew saw an ET. Again, the son of my sister-in-law, who also saw ETs. But you know what? I did start having sightings right after I started investigating this stuff. I had a very strange sighting, probably around 1992, which was really when I started investigating the Topanga Canyon wave. And I was driving home from my sister-in-law when I saw this little ball of light. I thought it was a bird, come swooping down in front of my car. I'm like, well, that's not a bird. It was about a foot in front of my windshield, maybe two, and darted back and forth, size of a golf ball maybe, and dipped down and went straight up. And had a number of encounters since then, and a number of them are ambiguous lights, but some of them are very close up. And that's about it, really. I've had some very bizarre dreams, and perhaps one possible entity encounter in which I woke up and I swear I saw something standing next to my bed. Scared the living daylights out of me. My heart thumped really quickly, and I turned and went back to bed. Don't know why I did that. But that's certainly a pattern I've read before, and now I know. So I don't know what to think of this other than you look into it. We're going to look into you. All right, this is another subject that I just want to touch on briefly, which I wrote about, in which ETs tell people that they are related to us and we are related to them in a very direct way. There was a case that Whitley Strieber talked about in which a lady saw gray-type ETs and she screamed out at them, "Oh, you're so ugly." And they said, "Well, one day you're going to look just like us." And Carla Turner talks about a number of cases, two at least, in which ETs came and told the abductees, "You are us," in one case, and another was, "We are you." Kim Carlsberg, a local abductee and artist, she wrote a book about her experiences, Beyond My Wildest Dreams, also had this experience where she was told flat out, "We are you." Anne Druffel talks about another case, an abduction on Palos Verdes, in which one of the witnesses was told by the ETs that the Zeta Reticulans are actually our ancestors. So what we're looking at is either a case where there are ancient parents or there are far removed children. A possibility that I'm not willing to discount because there's enough cases you can march off to support this sort of time traveler theory. At this point, my assessment is still that we're dealing mostly with biological beings from other planets in the classical sense who have mastered interdimensional travel and things like this, which make it very confusing. And their behavior is so bizarre that people sort of stretch towards other theories at times. But the longer I research this, I'm still thinking, I can't get away from the extraterrestrial hypothesis.
What about all three of those being true?
Yeah, I don't think those are mutually exclusive. This happened to Betty Andreasen as well. ETs told her flat out that we are related and we are much the same thing. And they told her that, interestingly, I thought one of the messages that Quaz got, the main ET that she spoke with, said that man is nature and love is the answer. So that's something I always bring up when people tell me, oh, ETs are demonic. I'm like, well, I don't know. They talk about love too. So yeah, a lot of cases like this, many cases in which people have been told that they were ETs in a past life and that they have the same sort of soul or were part of that group. Hard to say, but I think what this does speak towards is a much closer relationship with ETs than maybe even is believed within the UFO field. And got to remember that some of these ETs look exactly like us, and that raises serious questions, I think, about human origins. So this is about halfway through. I thought this might be a good time to take a quick break, so everyone can get some water, go to the restroom. I've got my books down at the table. There's limited copies, but they're $10 each, unless you buy 3, and then it's $25. But yeah, let's take a quick break, and then we'll get right back to it. All right. But I've got so much interesting information I want to share. Next thing I want to talk about is a chapter I call The Incredible Shrinking Abductee, because I started hearing about these strange cases. We've all heard of UFOs that decrease in size or increase in size. It can start out as a little ball of light and turn into a giant craft, or it can be a giant craft and shrink into a little ball of light and off it goes. But it's certainly not limited to that. Betty Andreasen, well-known abductee, saw a man being taken into a UFO, at which point another UFO shined on that UFO he had just been taken into and shrunk it down. This alarmed her, and the ET she was standing next to said, "Oh, don't worry, we call that deopulating," but did not explain what deopulating is, other than they have the ability to shrink the kids. This has been reported in a number of cases. Denise and Bert Twiggs, who I talked about earlier, also had this experience and sometimes found themselves looking up at the ETs and sometimes found themselves looking down at the ETs when they were taken on board, and finally asked them about it and confirmed that they were being changed in size, and saw some of their other friends taken on board and saw this happen as well. John Keel, well-known investigator, talks about a lady who saw a tiny football-sized UFO. It landed and outstepped these little inch-high creatures, entities. So apparently, size doesn't really matter when it comes to UFOs. An English abductee, Gaynor Sunderland, has had a number of encounters all her life. One involved her brother, when she saw her brother hit by a beam of light, shrunk down into a tiny little thing, and pulled aboard a UFO. Now, they can control their craft as well. I already talked a little bit about Carl Higden, the hunter from Wyoming, who saw elk aboard the UFO, and he was taken into this 10-foot wide UFO, and on the inside, it was much larger. A lot of cases like that. Jacques Vallée talks about at least 2 cases in Northern California in which people were taken aboard UFOs that appeared to be about the size of a house, but on the inside were stadium-sized. I know another case just like that in Colorado, in which a young boy and his grandfather saw a UFO landed on the dirt road in front of them. It just barely stretched across the road. They were taken on board. It was the size of a gymnasium. It was huge and 3 stories high. Just this massive city inside this one little room. So they have this ability to control space in a way that's just, God, it's almost magical. This happened to Bill and Peggy Foster, who experienced an abduction in North Carolina into a triangular-shaped craft. They went under hypnosis, Bill Foster ended up having a lot of encounters and becoming to the point where he's having fully conscious encounters where he was taken aboard this craft and became very confused because it kept changing sizes. Finally, he turns to the ET and says, "How big is this craft?" He says, "This is the first time he ever saw the gray smile." It smiled at him and says, "It's as big as we want it to be." I talked about this last time I spoke here when a Navy medic was taken aboard a craft, and the room he was in kept changing sizes. This is a very rare detail, but I've heard it a number of times. John Lear and Leonard Stringfield interviewed a gentleman who was a Navy photographer and was taken to Norton Air Force Base, which, by the way, is not far from here, to photograph a UFO that they were holding at the base. Norton Air Force Base is implicated a number of times in these crash retrieval incidents. And it was his job to photograph metals, and they wanted him to photograph the outside of the craft, which looked to be about 20 feet across. And they told him to photograph the inside, and he looked in, and he says it was about 3 or 4 times the size than it looked on the outside. So this is very strange, and I think, yeah, again, points to the level of their technology. Now, they can not only shrink things, they can expand things, including people. John Hunter Gray, who I mentioned earlier, who had an encounter in Richland Center, Wisconsin, well, he grew like 3 inches following his encounter. His feet size increased as well. An incident very much like this occurred to Sharon Stoll in New Mexico on April 29th, 1964. She was on the playground and saw a UFO, and it flashed a light at her, and it caused her to become very disoriented. She had burns on her face. She was hospitalized, and in the 2 months following this incident, she started to grow and mature very rapidly, and actually grew like a 1.5 feet, a half foot, and gained 20 pounds and became much more mature than she was before. I was recently talking about this on Facebook, and the guy's like, "Yeah, I'm different sizes when I'm taken on board this UFO, and each time I'm coming home and I'm measuring myself, and my height is changing sizes." He's like, "Have you ever heard of this?" I'm like, "Yes, I have. It's very rare, but it does happen." I also want to talk a little bit about angel hair. There's been some research on this, not a lot. Angel hair is a substance that's emitted from UFOs. We don't know exactly what it is. It's very wispy, like cotton candy, usually dissolves very quickly. A very well-known incident occurred right here in Canoga Park, San Fernando Valley, not far from actually where I live. This was on November 16th, 1953, when dozens of people saw these silver spheres moving across the valley here, being chased by jets. And as they did, they were letting out these huge strands of like this cotton candy type substance. And there was a lot of it. It was draped over trees and buildings and cars and sidewalks, and people were collecting it. Military officials showed up. Most of it dissolved on contact. But these cases occur all over the world, and some scientists have managed to capture samples before they've disintegrated. There's lots of theories that this is something related to their propulsion system, or perhaps a byproduct of the electromagnetic machines that they use. But the samples showed that they contained silicon, magnesium, calcium, and boron, which are all naturally occurring substances, though boron is relatively rare. And it's interesting because boron has the quality of absorbing neutrons and is used to control and guard nuclear power plants, nuclear reactors. So perhaps that has something to do with it. But I just wanted to touch briefly on the whole angel hair phenomenon because you don't hear a lot about it. Also wanted to touch on extraterrestrial gardeners. We know that ETs are collecting animals. We know that they're abducting humans, taking our genetic material. Well, they're also taking our plants. There's a long history of cases like this. There was one really kind of an interesting case, I thought, which occurred in Puerto Rico in 1991 to the Camacho family, who were approached by their neighbors and says, you know, we saw a UFO hovering over your house the other night. Like, you did? That's weird. We didn't see it. Well, a couple of nights later, Mrs. Camacho is woken up because she hears something fussing around outside, looks out her window, and this ET, this kind of gray type ET, is staring at her Swiss cheese plant, a split-leaf philodendron, pretty common house plant. It does have some medicinal properties, I believe. And it was picking the leaves. And she's like, hey, knocked on the window, and it looked up and it scared it off. And she's like, you wouldn't believe what happened. She told her husband. A couple of nights later, same exact thing happened. By this time, it had taken almost all the leaves off of her Swiss cheese plant. For whatever reason, they wanted them. But yeah, a lot of cases like this. A very famous case in Valençon, France, occurred in June 1965 to Maurice Massey, who started to notice that his lavender plants were missing, and he could not figure out who was taking them until he came outside one day and saw this landed UFO and occupant picking his flowers. And he chased him away, and the case became very well known and celebrated because it left these very distinct landing traces. A lot of cases where ETs seem to show an interest in plants. Diane Tessman, she used to be here in California, I think she's now in the Midwest, is a researcher who uncovered a number of cases like this. One involves a guy from the Netherlands, a tulip farmer, who was woken up because his greenhouse was glowing, and he went outside and there was a human-looking but strange figure in his greenhouse who told him his tulips were being overwatered. And he had missing time at that point, and was apparently taken on board where the ETs removed a large mole from his body and left. Diane Tessman reports on another case involving an Irish forestry worker in Ireland, and he saw what he thought was a plane crashing into the forest, went to go look for it, and was approached by this human-looking figure, basically human, who expressed an interest in the trees, and particularly the diseases that the trees were suffering from, and proceeded to educate this forestry worker on how to treat the various tree diseases. So I think that they're very interested in our plants. There are a number of cases where UFOs have hovered over areas, and the vegetation in this area becomes accelerated in its growth. There was a case like this reported by Jacques Vallée in Northern California, where a UFO hovered over this field, and the grass there grew up to about 6 feet in height. Another lady, she had a UFO hovering over her garden, sending down beams of light. Next morning, she went to her garden. Everything was 3 times higher than all the other vegetation around. Her neighbors were like, how did you get your plants to grow like that? And she didn't tell them. So yeah, a lot of cases like this where UFOs affect plants in very strange ways. One guy, was growing carrots in a little dish in his trailer. A UFO shined a light on his trailer. The next morning, the carrot was down to the floor. It did not look like a carrot anymore. So I think, yeah, ETs have a huge effect on plants, and they're collecting all the different plants on our planet. And again, I don't think we're going to have to worry about extinction because ETs are collecting everything. I want to talk a little bit about people who've been rescued by UFOs while being lost at sea. I've got a number of cases. I'll just briefly mention one. There's a number of cases in which castaways have seen UFOs and not been rescued, but have seen these objects hovering over them. But there's a few cases where people have actually been rescued. Probably the most dramatic example occurred in 1994 when a Force 12 storm hit the South Pacific near the New Zealand area. They had an annual regatta, sort of a boat race that was informal, where lots of people would go out and just take their boats out. When this unexpected Force 12 storm showed up and started swamping boats right and left. So this was a huge problem for the rescuers because all these UPARS, these emergency locators, were going off in these boats. There were so many of them that the signals were getting crossed. And although the witnesses, the people who were in these boats, could have radio contact with the rescuers could not find them. And this is what was happening to this family on their boat, which they called the Ramtha. And their boat was sinking, and they were in contact with the rescuers, but the rescuers could not find them. When suddenly this giant glowing light came over their boat. This is a painting done of the actual rescue incident. And the rescuer says, "Oh, is that you? Did you just set off a flare?" And the people on the ramp said, "Well, no, but there's something hovering over our boat, and we don't know what it is." And but that's us. And so the rescuers came and pulled them off the boat, and literally an hour or two later, that boat dipped beneath the waves. So they were rescued just in time. And what was, they recorded this in the logbook on the ship, the Malawi, which rescued them. About 2 days later, there was another sighting in the same area, and they went to go research it, and they found this UFO, and it was hovering over the wreck of the Ramtha again, which actually allowed the family to recover their boat, which hadn't completely sunk, it was just utterly swamped. And as a result of this second UFO sighting, they were able to get their boat back and recover, a lot of money, which this was basically their life savings that they had sunk into this. So it's a very bizarre case. Not a lot of cases like this. A lot of these cases just seem to defy the standard model of contact, and I think it shows really how bizarre ET contact can be. One chapter I'm not going to get too deep into again focuses on the smell of UFOs. I've not heard of any really in-depth studies in which people have studied what do UFOs smell like on the inside. And I can tell you it's, generally speaking, not good. It smells kind of funky, cheesy, sulfury. A lot of people describe, one lady says, "Oh, I smelled Franken beans." I'm like, "You gotta be kidding." And she's like, "No, it smelled just like, hot dogs." I'm like, "Okay." Got another case just like that. The lady says, "Well, it smelled like beans." I'm like, "Oh, okay." And I found that these odors can be broken down into two main categories. This sort of organic, locker room, cheesy smell. Only one person said it smelled like chicken. I'm not sure I believe that one. But a lot of people also described a chemical odor, sort of an ozone odor, an electrical odor, a metallic odor. And I think what these odors tell us is two things. One, we're dealing with metallic machines which have electricity, or the use of electricity, because there's a very strong ozone smell in a lot of these cases, which says we're dealing with actual craft. And the second is the fact that these are organic odors, which I think means we're dealing with biological beings much like us. Whitley Strieber talked about how they smelled kind of like burning cardboard or cinnamon even. I've heard that in a number of cases. So yeah, they do smell. Here's another weird procedure that takes place on board UFOs. There's all kinds of weird sort of things that people who are taken on board go through. And one is called these immersion pools or UFO pools, in which people are placed into this liquid and submerged and told to breathe it. In some cases, these are open pools, in others they're tanks, and some they're chairs that kind of come down from the ceiling and enclose a person and fill up with liquid. And they're like, "Breathe, breathe, breathe." And generally speaking, the witnesses don't want to breathe because we're kind of trained not to breathe liquid. But when they do, they find that they can actually breathe. And one guy was told flat out, this is how we are able to transport people through high gravitational stresses. But we don't know what the real reason is. There's been a lot of speculation that they're perhaps measuring people, or maybe this has got some sort of a medical procedure. We really don't know. It's not super common, but Yvonne Smith has covered cases like this. Robert Jacobs has. I've got a couple of cases myself. of this type of procedure. What I do find interesting is we have this ability to do it as well with something called perfluorocarbons, where the Navy has done research on breathable liquids. And what they do is they oxygenate water to the extent where it contains more oxygen, up to 65%, more oxygen than is present in air itself, and have been able to keep animals alive for short periods of time. And in a few cases, there was one case involving a baby who was kept alive, who was born premature using perfluorocarbons. I've been told that actually we have advanced quite far into this technology and are using it within the Navy. It's just classified. I was not able to confirm that though. Also want to talk about alien drinks. This is something that occurs pretty regularly where people are given liquids to drink on board a UFO. No, it's not a martini or something like that. Generally, no, they don't like the taste of it. It's described as bitter, chalky, white. In some cases, it's overly sweet. Sometimes it's sort of put in a tube-like device and put down the throat. Other times, people are given like glasses or cups or inverted pyramids. A number of people describe this liquid as being sort of neon colored. Neon blue comes up in a number of cases, red, orange. There was a very famous case in England where the whole family was taken on board and everyone was given this sort of bitter white liquid to drink as they exited, except for the youngest. And it turned out this was sort of like a rohypnol. It made them forget everything that happened. So yeah, I think aliens are giving people these drinks for various reasons. There's a few cases that seem to point towards it being medicinal. Some cases that seem to point towards it being nourishment. But in a number of cases, it seems to be used to make people forget. It's very hard to say. We don't know for sure. But a lot of people have had this. Betty Andreasen experienced this. Antonio Carlos Vieira, an abductee from Brazil, was made to drink this very dark liquid. Donna Butts from Russell, Kansas, who had a major contactee case, said that she was made to drink a blue liquid. One of Hopkins' clients, Dorothy Wallace, was made to drink a blue liquid. Filiberto Cardenas, an abductee from Florida, had the same experience. So yeah, we don't know what it is for. One gentleman I did talk to said he had a ET sort of hybrid appear in his room and gave him this liquid which cured him of a very persistent chest cold. So perhaps they are medicinal in some cases, hard to say. I want to talk a little bit about UFOs and rockets and how closely they've been observing our exploration into space. And the short answer is very closely. From day one, starting in like 1947 over White Sands, where we were testing all kinds of V-2 rockets, these UFOs would appear regularly, and all these rocket scientists would watch these objects track the missiles. They were using something called a theodolite. And theodolite is a telescope that is attached to a measuring device, and it allows you to triangulate UFOs and sort of their size and distance. And so they were able to get a good read on how large these objects were and how high up. And they were 20, 30 feet across. In one incident, the guy who was in charge of the missile test accused the guy of losing sight of the missile. And he's like, no, I've got it right here. Turned out it was a UFO he was actually tracking. So this started at White Sands, and throughout the 1940s and 1950s, it was very common there, to the point that the commander of the base, Robert McLaughlin, went public and talked about it, which turned out to be a huge embarrassment for the Air Force, and they tried to backtrack. But while White Sands was dealing with this virtual invasion on an almost weekly basis, so was China Lake here in California. According to Richard Thompson, who wrote a book called Alien Identities, he interviewed a man who said, oh yeah, everyone here at China Lake, we know all about it. I can tell you 50 people who have watched missile launches and seen these UFOs tracking them. So this is very common. This is a picture of Dr. Robert Jacobs, who was in charge of photographing a missile test at Vandenberg Air Force Base on September 15, 1965. It's a pretty well-known case, and he filmed these UFOs basically disabling an Atlas missile, an Atlas F missile. The UFO flew around it, sent out 3 beams of light, and the missile crashed into the ocean. He was taken to the office of his superior, Major Mansman, and asked, what was that? As they reviewed the footage, they said, well, it looks like a UFO to me, is what he said. And he was told never to talk about it and that it didn't happen. Well, he ended up going public and suffered badly for it. He was attacked and ridiculed by arch debunkers like Phil Klass. He was threatened, received threatening phone calls. His mailbox was blown up. He was fired from his job at some point. He had the last word, though, because investigators tracked it down and finally found Major Mansman, who was dying of cancer on his deathbed, and he confirmed the whole incident. So he's a very lucid speaker on the subject and becomes very emotional and says it's high time that people know that these sort of things are going on all the time. This happened at Seal Beach. So the Saturn V rocket, according to Stephen Greer back in the 1960s, more than 400 people saw this UFO hovering right over the rocket. You can list case after case in which UFOs are seen over rockets, even to the point of toy rocket launches. And this points towards how very closely they're monitoring us. There's a case which took place in Arizona in 1968, in which a guy was just sending off, put a little lizard in a toy rocket, sent it off, and UFOs showed up and were monitoring it. Another case in upstate New York, a father went to launch toy rockets with his sons, and right after they started launching it, these UFOs showed up. So this points towards how very closely UFOs are monitoring our exploration into space. There's case after case like this. Here's a very recent case, 2012, in China, the Shenzhou 9 rocket. This was being filmed, of course, and as people are watching it, 2 UFOs showed up, crossed the path of the rocket. Shortly later, the rocket failed. So we're seeing in a number of cases where these UFOs are not only monitoring these launches, they are intervening and sometimes causing these missiles to fail. We all know, of course, the Malmstrom incident in Montana. Robert Salas has spoken about this a number of times, in which UFOs basically shut down our nuclear missiles. A number of cases like that. Another real recent case is the Russian Proton M rocket. When a UFO appeared, crosses right in front of this rocket. It was just at the stage where it was about to launch a satellite when the rocket failed. Officials declined to comment on the UFO, naturally. Okay, I want to talk about another subject, which is observed abductions. According to the Rover poll, 1 in 50 people have had an onboard UFO experience, which sounds like a lot, but many major researchers echo this. Bud Hopkins certainly. Jacques Vallée talks a lot about this. A lot of researchers feel like there is a hidden epidemic of UFO abductions, and I certainly agree. That's how I started investigating, is when I heard J. Allen Hynek say that 1 in 40 people have had an onboard experience. And I thought, no, that's too much. I know 40 people. I don't know a single abductee. I was wrong. I knew about 4 or 5 of them within my circle of family, friends, and coworkers. So yeah, this is quite common, but it's almost never observed. A lot of people are being abducted, but no one's seeing it happen for the most part. But there are a scattering of cases where these abductions are observed by outside witnesses. And the question, of course, is why? Is this being allowed by the ETs? Is this an accident? or do they not care, or do they want people to see this happen? This is a picture of Filiberto Cardenas. In 1979, he was driving with his wife and another couple when a UFO hovered over their car, causing the engine to fail. They didn't see it at this point. They went outside and were opening up the engine and trying to figure out what was wrong with their car when this UFO dropped down and sucked Filiberto right up into it in full view of his family and friends. And he's screaming, don't take me, don't take me. And they took him. And next thing he knows, he has some missing time. And he's several miles away and deposited in a field. The police finally found him. But it was a typical case of this abduction that occurred in full view of witnesses. There are a number of cases like this. June 30th, 1988, Martin Cohen was walking through Leeds Park one evening. This is in London, or in England, in Leeds, England. And this UFO appeared over him and pulled him up in a purple beam of light. And several people around him actually saw him being pulled into this object. The next morning, he was deposited in the same area, and another person actually saw him being put back down. So these cases are pretty darn rare, but they do occur. There was another case reported to MUFON, which occurred on June 14th, 1994 in Arkansas. And this couple was driving along, and they got lost and pulled into the suburbs somehow. They were on a highway, and next thing they know, they're in the suburbs and trying to find the highway again. And they see this weird glow around this house. And the girlfriend, she's asleep at this point, and the boyfriend, he's looking at this house trying to figure out what is going on. So he gets out of the car, leaving it parked basically in the middle of the road there, and walks up the driveway and sees that there's an object hovering over the house. He freaks out, runs, gets his girlfriend. She comes back, and they're looking at this thing, trying to figure out what it is, when suddenly a woman floats down from the object down to the house and through into the house to a closed window. That freaked them out enough where they just took off. I'm thinking the ETs have to know that they're being observed, because that's usually the pattern I see in most of these cases. Leonard Stringfield, probably best known for his crash retrieval cases, did do a lot of research into all kinds of cases, abductions and sightings. He talked about a case that he uncovered in New Mexico, in Hobbs, New Mexico, where a farmer was driving along, pulled up to his house. This UFO was right above his truck, and no sooner did he pull right up to his house, his wife, his kids are there watching, when this UFO sucks his pickup truck right up into the object, and he was never seen again. About a year later, they did find the body of a gentleman who was another missing Hobbs resident. But in this case, this farmer was not returned, which is perhaps the reason why the ETs didn't care if they were being observed, presuming that they were ETs. When I spoke recently up in Northern California at the UFOCon, I was approached by a gentleman, Steve Omar, a Hawaiian researcher, and he talked about a case where he was a part of, actually. This occurred in 1973. There was a bunch of UFO activity on Maui Island in the Hana district, particularly over the 7 sacred pools, which I've been there. I went from the top all the way down to the bottom of the 7 sacred pools. Know the area pretty well. I have friends who live there. And he talked about how they set up this sort of expedition to go and monitor the UFO activity that was very active at that time. And he had this whole little UFO group formed that would investigate cases regularly. And one of them involved his secretary, Kathy Conway, and they were there at the bottom of the 7 sacred pools when this UFO showed up. She was amazed, and she dived in the water and goes right under this thing, and this object pulled her up into the object, and she was never seen again. They don't know what happened to her. They've continued to look for her. When the internet finally came around, they looked for her again, could not find her. So in a number of these cases of observed abductions, people are not returned, which is a sort of an alarming pattern, to say the least. A controversial case occurred in Northumberland, Pennsylvania on August 4th, 2002, when a number of people in this area saw UFOs. One guy was drawn outside by his horses acting peculiar, saw this UFO, and sent on a beam of light, and he saw a man being pulled up into the beam of light. This was right over Montour Ridge. At the same time, there was a group of fishermen seeing this thing sending down beams of light. A number of witnesses throughout this area saw this UFO. Well, the next day, the local resident Todd Sees was reported missing. He had been hiking and hunting up on Montour Ridge. They sent out a huge search party. Eventually 200 people and canine units looked for this gentleman. It was about 30 hours later when his body was found very close towards his home in a different area from where he had been, in an area that had been very thoroughly searched. There was no way he could have been missed where he was found. He was dead. He had no marks on his body, no apparent cause of death. There was a dead rattlesnake next to him as well, which he had no snake bite on his body. So this caused a huge incident, apparently a cover-up, and I was able to find this blurry picture of a newspaper article. But there's not a whole lot of information about this case. Here's another case from Australia involving a lady by the name of Amy Rylance. She and her husband were sleeping one night when their roommate, Petra Heller, woke up because the room filled with light. She was sleeping in the living room. She watched Amy Rylance in an unconscious state being pulled out of her bedroom, across the living room, and out through a closed window into a large object that was hovering outside, and completely freaked her out. She screamed. She woke up. Her husband, by this point, Amy, is missing. She was found some 8 hours away near a gas station. She was extremely disoriented, had amnesia, no memory of the incident, and in fact, took her a couple of hours to even remember her own name. Had a number of medical symptoms. The police were suspicious and wanted to accuse them of hoaxing, but could find no evidence of it. The case still became controversial, and even though at one point she did sign a notarized affidavit saying that what she was saying did actually happen to her. So yeah, observed abductions are pretty darn rare, but they do occur. There's an abductee in England by the name of Jason Andrews, and if you ever get a chance to read his book, gosh, you should. The name of it is escaping me right now. But it's an amazing story. He had encounters since he was a child, and his family was witnessing a lot of this activity to the point where they would wake up at night and he would not be in the house. One evening, Ann Andrews hears Jason's younger brother crying in the bedroom. She goes rushing in and says, "What's wrong?" And he says, "Well, they just took Jason. I saw them. You know, they're being really brazen. They don't even care anymore. Just took him right in front of me." And he was really upset about it. The whole family was. They're like, "This is ridiculous." They wanted to call the police, and we're about to do so. Instead, they called another abductee who was trying to get them to calm down. At this point, Ann Andrews was in the living room, and suddenly the staircase lit up with bright white light, and there was Jason Andrews. He appeared right there. He says, "Yep, they just took me. They wanted to talk." And it's a very extensive contactee case, but a great example of an observed abduction. Whitley Strieber had a very similar experience where he woke up, couldn't find his 5-year-old son, and not in the house, searched the whole house. Finally, he ran outside, and there was this huge UFO. And he got this just feeling of cold dread because he knew that his son was in that object. And at this point, gray ETs showed up and kind of calmly escorted him back to bed. So pretty darn rare. Probably the best known case, of course, is the Brooklyn Bridge abduction. Bud Hopkins wrote the book Witnessed entirely about this case. And this is a good example, I think, of an abduction that the ETs wanted people to observe, because there was a group of people on the Brooklyn Bridge watching this happen, running around in a panic. There were people within her building who saw it happen, and there were people on the street who saw it happen as well. He eventually recovered, I think, close to a dozen witnesses. And one of the witnesses said she saw numerous people being abducted, as well as herself. So it looks like it might have been a mass abduction. And maybe they just had to do something that was so important that they didn't care if they were being seen. A lot of people saw this. When I first started researching these observed abductions, the Brooklyn Bridge abduction case hadn't happened yet. But when you take together the number of cases in which people are being abducted, this is almost statistically insignificant. But there are enough cases that really warrant, I think, an investigation. Jim Cumber, he was like 15 years old in New Mexico, a real aviation enthusiast, was watching a group of planes in the sky when one of them disappeared. Thought, well, that's odd. And we saw another one disappear, and suddenly all the planes landed. And this experience haunted him to the point where he eventually became a MUFON field investigator and later the state section director. So a good witness. So I'm not sure what to think about these cases, other than I'm definitely alarmed about how in some of these cases people are not returned or die as a result of it.
Preston, is that the one that lit in the Piano of the sector?
Correct, yeah.
And then didn't the Secretary General of the UN witness that as well?
Yeah, according to Stephen Greer, Perez de Cuellar.
Yeah.
And Stephen Greer has a completely different take on the incident, calling it mind control abductions. I'm not sure I believe that, but certainly it's a possibility. I want to talk a little bit about UFO prejudice against UFO witnesses, which is a real problem, it turns out. I uncovered a number of cases where people have seen a UFO or expressed an interest in investigating UFOs and lost their job as a result of it. This happened to Leah Haley, who her company found out, she was an accountant, found out that she was an abductee, and she received a lot of pressure and ridicule and was eventually forced out of her job. Same thing happened to Alan Godfrey, a police officer in England who saw a UFO land on the road in front of him, actually abducted him. He didn't realize this at the time. There was an enormous amount of evidence to support his case, physical evidence. The road where he saw the UFO was completely dry, even though it was pouring rain all night. A number of people within the area saw UFOs, including neighboring counties. But despite this, he received quite a bit of ridicule from his fellow officers. And when more sightings occurred, well, his sighting became more famous. And he's like, see, there's other people seeing this. So his fellow officers stopped ridiculing him, but his superiors now started pressuring him and actually asked him to resign. He refused. He said, I'm not resigning. He was a decorated investigator, had won awards. He loved being a police officer. He was a well-respected member of the community. And they wanted him to resign. He refused, so they took away his police car and gave him a bicycle. Rude and really unfair. And he ended up resigning because everything he loved about being a police officer was gone. Police officers suffer very badly from this. It's unfortunate because these are the guys, that's their job. They're there to look for anything unusual, to protect us from stuff that's, invading. And they can't talk about it because they get fired. There was a very well-known case which occurred in 1966 when two police officers chased a UFO across 2 states, chasing it, across Ohio at speeds of 100 miles per hour. Several other officers saw it. A lot of people saw this object. Someone actually photographed it. Despite this, there was an enormous amount of ridicule heaped on both of these witnesses, and both ended up resigning. This happened to a California police officer who had a UFO hover over him, send down a beam of light, actually causing a sunburn on his face, which everyone around him saw. He says, there's no doubt in my mind I was passed up from promotions as a result of this encounter. This is S. Scott Corder, who was investigating a case in Russell, Kansas, which I mentioned briefly, the Donna Butts case. He was a doctor, and the medical board in Kansas found out he was investigating UFOs and tried to declare him incompetent, forced him to take a psychological evaluation test. He didn't want to do it, but at some point he was forced into doing it, and they tried to fire him. He fought back and won the case, but was not able to get any damages, but he was able to keep his job. This has happened to a lot of people. John Mack, when he was investigating UFOs, Pulitzer Prize-winning author, by the way, his associates did not like him looking into this phenomena and conducted a study of him and tried to sort of discredit him. He also fought back, but almost lost his job, but didn't. Probably the most tragic case is, look what happened to Frances Barwood. Remember her from the Phoenix Lights. She got into the thick of it, and as a result, was not reelected. She was called a UFO candidate and received an enormous amount of ridicule. It's a real problem. I bring it up at work all the time. My boss is fine with it. For whatever reason, all the bosses I've had have been fine with it. But I think it depends on your profession. Kenju Chiroshi, who saw a UFO in 1986 over Alaska, the case that actually woke me up, he was taken off flying duty for years and years and given death duty. Finally was allowed to fly again. But as a result of going public with his story, he was grounded. The most tragic case that I can think of is what happened to Jeff Greenhalgh on October 17th, 1973. He was called to an incident in which a lady actually said she saw a UFO, and he saw, not the UFO, but this metallic entity in front of him on the road. He had a camera with him, a Polaroid camera, and he snapped a series of photos. I think these are among the best photos in terms of being authenticated. He's never been accused of a hoax, but he was badly attacked. He was ridiculed. At the time, he was the chief of police of this very small town. Took a series of 4 photographs that became well known, and this caused a lot of pressure to be placed on him. He lost his job. His wife left him. He received threats. His house was burned down by an arsonist, and he was basically ran out of town. But really some extraordinary photographs of this metallic suited entity which appeared in front of him in his car. He chased it at speeds of up to 30, 40 miles an hour, was not able to catch up with it. It made these big, long, loping strides, and finally just disappeared off into the distance. All right, we're drawing towards the end. I've just got a few more subjects I want to touch on. One is alien gifts, actual alien artifacts that are given to people. This is pretty rare, but it does happen. One case, well, you all know the Betty Hill case. She was literally walking off the UFO and had this little blue book that they'd given to her. She says, I need something to prove that this happened. And they said, well, go ahead, look around, pick something. She picked this blue book type thing, and they're like, well, you're not going to be able to make any sense of it. She said, I don't care, it's just to prove that this experience happened. And as she's walking down the ramp, the crew starts talking and said, no, and they took it back. But she was that close to actually having this alien book. This happened to Betty Andreasen. She was actually given a book, which she kept for 2 weeks and was able to observe at her leisure, but they also took that back and they told her that they would. So, but it's another one of these cases where people are given actual objects by the ETs. Oh, there's Betty Hill. Another case is the case of Bill Herman in Charleston, South Carolina. In the late 1970s, he started photographing these UFOs right outside the local Air Force base there. He thought it was military at first until one of them hovered right over him and sucked him inside, and he saw gray type ETs and ended up having a number of onboard encounters. His case received a lot of interest from prominent investigators like James Harder and Wendell Stevens and others. And at one point, he was in his trailer alone when a bright ball of light appeared on the counter. It flashed up really brightly and flashed out. A gray type ET appeared and said, "We are giving you this gift as a token of goodwill." And it was this metal bar with these engravings on it. They ended up having it examined and analyzed. It turned out to be nothing special. It's just terrestrial lead. But there were some unusual elements about it in the way it was formed and how these markings were placed in. So that was probably the most interesting thing about it. But he said it was given to him by the ETs, which sounds unusual, but there's another case that's almost exactly like that, which is not well known. This was uncovered by Constance Clear, who was investigating a Texas abductee, a man who was having missing time encounters. Under hypnosis, he recalled pretty harrowing medical experiments being done on him. It was not really a pleasant case at all. At some point, his encounter slowed down, and he had another missing time encounter. Under hypnosis, he recalled what happened, and he saw this ET who said that she was in charge. She said she was one of the only female ETs who had achieved this high of a rank, which I found kind of interesting. And she said, "We're done with you. We got what we want, and thank you." And he says, "I'm mad as hell." She says, "Well, what's mad? What's hell?" And he proceeded to explain to her that, "We've got emotions, and you're scaring the living daylights out of us." And she admitted, she says, "Yeah, well, human emotions do cause us a lot of problems." At some point, though, she said, "Here's this bar of metal, this sort of lead ore." She says, "If we decide to give this to you, you will find it somewhere." A couple of days later, he saw it on his bedroom shelf. The same thing he had seen aboard the UFO, just this little metal bar, a few inches long. And he picked it up, scooped it up, and drove directly towards Constance Clear's house. He was going to have, or her office, he was going to have a session with her when he was pulled over by apparently men in black who forced him off the road and took the object from him. This is Gabor Tarkali, a Romanian investigator in 1974, who investigated a case in which a bunch of locals saw a landed disc, and there were these golden-like sheets that they had been given. At this point, the police showed up and took all of this, and some of the witnesses were apparently killed, according to Tarkali. Here's another researcher, a French researcher, Jimmy Gieux, who reported on the case of a painter who had a number of encounters with a female humanoid who gave him a telescope-like device. Again, men in black showed up and took it. This is Robert Trallins. He talks about a case in Ecuador which occurred on September 3rd, 1966, in which two kids were walking around with a flashlight, saw a UFO and started talking to it in Morse code, saying, "Friends, please land." The UFO dropped to the ground and landed. They started to run away, and they're like, "No, stop. We want to talk with you." And they were pulled on board and had a basically friendly encounter where the ETs asked them a bunch of questions, but refused to answer any of the questions posed to them. And said, "Okay, we are done," and started to escort these boys off when they gave the ETs their flashlight, which apparently impressed the ETs because they gave the boys a flashlight-like device and showed them how to work it. All you had to do was squeeze it, and it would send out this beam of light. And they exited the UFO and were running home when helicopters surrounded them and jeeps and took them, these objects, and they were eventually relocated and could not be found. So a number of these cases, artifacts, yeah, people are given to them, but in case after case, they're scooped up immediately by who's ever monitoring this in terms of military or men in black. Then there's this case, the Joe Symington alien pancake case. Which sounds funny, but this guy is a reputable witness. He's got a number of character witnesses. At the time of his incident, people all over his neighborhood saw this UFO that actually landed in his backyard. He was taken on board, and these ETs gave him what looks like this sort of cracker. They were cooking it on this sort of flameless grill and handed it to him. He ate one. He said it was kind of cardboard, not really that good tasting. But it's a pretty legitimate case, actually, and what I find very interesting is the FDA and the Air Force were both very interested in it and took samples and had them analyzed. Turned out to be normal buckwheat. I don't know. It's a strange case, one of these weird outliers that I don't know quite what to make of. But there's a lot of cases like this. There was a case in Floyd's Knob, Indiana, in which a lady was given a rock. A number of cases in which people were given crystals. Certainly Billy Meyer, it's a controversial case, but he claims to have been given a number of crystals. There's a few cases where people have tried to steal objects off UFOs and have not been successful. This is Antonio Diaz-Boas, one of the first really publicized abductions. Just as he was being escorted out, he tried to grab this clock-like device. This really angered the ETs. One of them grabbed the device and pushed him over, and they escorted him right out. Another witness, Carol Watts, was able to photograph the object that he was taken on board. This was a controversial case. He was accused of a hoax, and later it turns out, no, he was telling the truth. But he was on board the UFO and pocketed this object. ETs came running in, pulled it out, and escorted him off. So I wouldn't recommend trying to steal an object from a UFO, but maybe if you give them something, they'll give you something back. But don't show anybody until you're sure that you can, not have it stolen from you. Okay, I'm wrapping up here. I've got just a few more I want to talk about, and then we'll wrap it up. Three more quick subjects because I know it's getting late. I wanted to talk about alien mistakes. Cases where people are abducted and returned to different locations. One case I investigated was a gentleman was driving through the Central Valley along the I-5. He was driving, he always likes to drive. They saw a UFO, it landed next to him on the road, struck him with a beam of light. Next thing he knows, he's not driving anymore, his friend is. There's a lot of cases like this. The Sandra Larson abduction had the same thing. People were put into different positions back in the car. In another case, which occurred in the Midwest, the Pat Roach case, an entire family was taken on board, and the only reason they knew the abduction had occurred is because all the children were returned to different beds. So a number of cases, ETs don't seem to really pay attention to where people are being put back. It's hard to say. There's another case, Stan Romanek. His case is controversial. He was recently accused of pornography. But sometimes I support his case. I interviewed him. He's got an enormous number of witnesses. I think he's telling the truth. But I do recognize the case is controversial. I talked to his wife. He's got a lot of photographs. He's got an enormous amount of evidence supporting his case. And I think that's why he was basically discredited, which actually happened to Wendell Stevens as well, by the way. And he describes an incident. Well, sometimes he was taken and then he would be returned and not able to get back inside even though the door was locked. I've got a number of cases like that. One lady was put out outside on a winter day and ended up having frostbite on her feet by the time she made it back inside. Stan Romanek talks about a time he went to bed wearing this t-shirt that he had been given as a friend. I got abducted by aliens and all I got was this lousy t-shirt. And when he was returned, he was wearing a woman's nightie. And there are a number of cases like this. But I always wonder about, if someone else was dressed up in this t-shirt and came back from abduction, literally got this t-shirt. Maybe it's alien humor, I don't know. But I'm not even sure if these are real mistakes or if these ETs are doing it on purpose to leave kind of calling cards. This happened to Ann and Jason Andrews, that case I mentioned earlier. Ann Andrews woke up because she heard someone in the hallway went out into the hallway, and there was a strange man, a complete stranger. He was totally nude. He was soaking wet. He was terrified. At that point, there was a huge flash of light. She had missing time, and the man was gone. And he had apparently been returned to the wrong location. There are many cases in which people have been abducted and returned many miles away. I'm not sure if this is purposeful or not. I also uncovered a number of cases, this is a completely separate subject, in which people have been able to make contact with UFOs through a Ouija board, of all things, which is usually used to contact ghosts. But there's an interdimensional aspect, certainly, to UFO encounters, and there's a case in Utah in which 2 children were using a Ouija board and basically made an appointment with a UFO, and it showed up, and the whole town saw it. It hovered right over the local hospital. So yeah, a number of cases where people have actually communicated with UFOs through a Ouija board and able to sort of initiate an encounter. Now I want to talk about UFOs over prisons. Did not know this was a thing either. Never heard anyone talk about it. Did some research into it, and I found prisons across the United States, jails, correctional institutes, where UFOs have been seen hovering over them. This is the Chateauguay Correctional Facility in New York, which had an encounter in 2001. Idaho Department of Correction, July 16, 2016, the whole staff and many prisoners saw this object hovering over the prison. In these cases, these objects stay for quite some time, 15, 20 minutes, one case, 3 hours. The Long Lartin prison in England, prison guard by the name of Jim Brace saw this object circling the prison over and over and over. He was about to call the tower guard when his radio wouldn't work, and at that point, his radio malfunctioned, and the UFO took off. Clearly, they were monitoring him and his observations. Michigan Department of Correction in Ionia, August 16, 1997. A number of prisoners observed the object. This is the Lebanon Correctional Facility in Ohio. An object hovered about 40 feet over the prison for about 3 hours. Police received a bunch of calls. The prison officials called the police as well, who confirmed that they were receiving calls. They ended up calling Wright Patterson, denied any knowledge of it or denied any information about it. Later, Wright Patterson was contacted and said, "Nobody called us. We don't know what you're talking about." So they basically lied and covered it up, the fact that they had received calls. Colorado prison has had encounters regularly for years. 1967, an object hovered for over 2 hours. It stayed so long that the prison officials were expecting there to be some sort of prison break. They called the local Air Force base, who sent out 2 jets to chase this object away, which they did. But the UFOs returned again. In 1965, there was an incident there where 2 guards saw this UFO close up. Following the incident, one of the guards suffered all kinds of psychological disturbances and felt very disoriented and couldn't sleep. They returned again in 1976, again in 1988, or 98 rather. I think they're attracted to installations of all kinds, and they're trying to figure out why we're keeping people in these cages. Just speculating here. Our prison population is pretty large. Probably some prisoners who are abductees. Maybe that's why they're there. I don't know if that's true. I couldn't find a single case involving a prisoner who was abducted from prison. But a really interesting case occurred on August 13th, 1960 over Red Bluff, California, when a wave of sightings occurred. Many people were seeing this over a widespread area. A large group of police officers were observing these objects, actually chasing them down the road, and this is what they saw. At this point, it was hovering over Red Bluff prison, or jailhouse. So they called the Red Bluff jail and asked them if they could see it. So what the guards did is they marched all the prisoners out onto the roof of the building, and all the prisoners got to see this UFO too. Interesting. I'm not sure exactly why the ETs are hovering over prisons, but it's definitely a thing. Did a chapter on is Jesus an alien? because there's been a lot of speculation about this, but no real research. And what I found was a smattering of cases in which people were taken on board a UFO and they saw a figure that they perceived as being Jesus or very Jesus-like. And there's enough cases to really make me scratch my head and think, what's going on here? Is this just being a religious interpretation, or what are they seeing here? But no, apparently this is what witnesses are describing. It's very rare, but it does happen. Also, a number of cases involving the UFO Bigfoot connection. Most people who see Bigfoot don't see UFOs. I've done a lot of Bigfoot research, by the way. I had my own Bigfoot encounter up in Acton. I'm absolutely convinced it's a real phenomenon, but it's separate. And most people who see a UFO obviously don't see Bigfoot, but there's less than 1%, I'm guessing, of the cases. This does happen. There's 30 or 40 or more cases in which people have seen a UFO, and at the same time will have a Bigfoot encounter, or perhaps right before it or right after. It's really hard to make sense of these cases, and I don't know quite what's going on. There's a famous case like that in Pennsylvania, another case in Ohio where Frederick Bozak was driving along and he saw a UFO and looked inside of it and saw a Bigfoot-like creature. A case in Colorado where a gentleman approached a landed UFO and there was a Bigfoot there being ordered around by the aliens like it was some sort of pet or something. So I don't know quite what to make of these cases. One case I investigated myself occurred up in Canyon Country, right here in Southern California. It's actually a very rural area. I had no idea that it had any Bigfoot history, but it turns out it does. I talked to this guy by the name of Robert, a radiologist, who had a UFO land in his backyard. The next day, he had a Bigfoot encounter. Following the Bigfoot encounter, he had an extreme poltergeist breakout in his home. So I don't know exactly what's going on here, but there's some sort of loose connection between UFOs and Bigfoot that I just can't quite make sense of. Did a chapter on alien anal probes, because if I had a nickel for every time I've been asked about it, I'd be rich. For some reason, the media has really fixated on this particular aspect. It's just one of many procedures abductees undergo, but society has become fixated on it to the point there are t-shirts, there are buttons, there's a hot sauce you can buy called Alien Anal Probe Hot Sauce. It's out of control, and people continue to ask me about, oh, I don't want to be abducted by aliens and anally probe. Don't worry, it's not going to happen. It's actually pretty rare. I scanned literature pretty extensively, and I could only find, gosh, a dozen cases about where it was clearly described. Willie Strieber described it. I talked to one of my witnesses who described it pretty extensively. But by and large, there's not a whole lot of information out there about it. Now, the last thing I want to talk about today is a chapter in which people are taken into the engine room of a UFO and told how it works. This is actually pretty common. When someone's taken on board a UFO, most people will be examined, physically examined. That's the most common thing I hear. Second to that is being given messages of some kind, usually having to do with alternative healing, perhaps, or warnings of disasters. But next to that is alternative energy. ETs seem to be very interested in that, and they'll take people into their engine room, and they'll tell them exactly how these UFOs work, which by and large involves some sort of electromagnetism or magnetics for the most part. This happened to Whitley Strieber. He talks in his book about how he tried to build this sort of free energy motor as a kid. And he remembers it well. He almost burnt his wing of the house down, but didn't really think much of it until he was investigating his case and talking to all his childhood friends. And his friend says, oh yeah, you used to talk about aliens all the time. You said you were being visited by spacemen and they told you how to build one of their motors. He didn't remember that, but he does remember trying to build this thing and caused all the electrical system in the entire house to fail. The next day, there was a huge fire where he had tried to plug this machine in, which was basically counter-rotating magnets. Now, according to magnetic theory, this shouldn't really do anything, but apparently it does. He talks about another case, Strieber does, in which a farmer had the same sort of thing. He had an encounter. Years later, he became obsessed with building a magnetic motor and built it and turned it on, at which point all the metal objects in his barn went flying toward the machine and crushed it. Yeah, I mean, a lot of cases like this. There's another case from Jacques Vallée involving a lady named Helen, who was abducted while driving with 3 of her friends. She came away from her encounter absolutely obsessed with the idea of building a magnetic motor. Jacques Vallée asked her to describe it, and he said the way she described it, it would never work, but she's made it her life mission. I found a lot of cases like this. There was a case in Australia where a gentleman saw a UFO and come into the room with a bunch of people. It was this ball of light, and it zipped out, and he followed it out onto the river and found this very large craft there. And he motored up a boat right up to it, tried to get under it, and each time he did, the UFO would move farther away. He could only get so close to it, and then at some point it left. And he thought, well, that was it. Except following that, he started having all these dreams about building electromagnetic motors, and became absolutely obsessed with it to the point that he is still trying to build it. I have a case like this myself, which I talked about quite a bit last time I was here, by a gentleman by the name of Jim Kubelbeck, who had an encounter where he was apparently taken on board, told how this UFO engine worked, and inspired to build a free energy motor, which he did, a sort of an inertia device, using magnets and a bicycle wheel and a bunch of odds and ends from a hardware store. And he says, and his family verified this, that this thing would just turn and turn and turn for about 2 or 3 weeks with almost no energy. He was too embarrassed to really talk about it, and I couldn't get any more information about it, unfortunately. I found another case reported to MUFON by Virgil E. Atkinson, a naval officer from Coos Bay, Oregon, who had an encounter while on the base in which he was examined. He said he saw a device which displayed his thoughts on a screen. And he came away from his experience with the same obsession to sort of build electromagnetic motors. And he ended up taking out a bunch of patents, which I looked up, and they're out there. Same thing happened to Jesse and John Long, one of Yvonne Smith's clients, particularly John Long, who really was not a great student. He admits he did not enjoy high school, got terrible grades, but following his encounters became absolutely obsessed with building electromagnetic motors and sort of free energy motors, and got to the point where he submitted one to the patent office and got the attention of the government, who said that they were reviewing it to see if they wanted to mark it secret. And if they did, he would have to not only withdraw this patent, but he would have to tell them everything about it, and anyone who was told about it would also have to be sworn to secrecy. So what he did is he divided the invention into 2 pieces and just sort of backdoored it by dividing it up into 2 different inventions, and was able to get it through the patent office that way. But he's made it his mission to sort of bring this technology out. And I think that's what we're looking at here, is ETs are so concerned about our planet and the use of fossil fuels, and the fact that we have this technology and it's not being released and it's not being used, that they're doing a grassroots movement. I'm speculating here, but this is what I think is happening, is they're like, all right, if the government, the leaders on this planet are not going to do it, we're going to go to the people and we'll find someone who will. Again, that's pure speculation, but definitely there's enough cases, again, to really make this a real phenomenon. So I think those are basically all the subjects I had time to talk to you about tonight. But I think what these show is that ETs are not only stranger than most people are talking about. There's all kinds of activities and cases that investigators aren't talking about because they defy the standard model of contact. And yet there's enough to prove that this is a real phenomenon. And I think these cases show that these are ETs. I mean, if they're hovering over our minds and taking our metal, if people are smelling metallic engines and they smell these sort of organic odors, why are ETs hovering over graveyards? These cases do leave us with a lot of unanswered questions, but I think they show how truly bizarre and strange the UFO phenomenon really is. But I want to thank you very much and for listening.